I think YouTubers are good for boxing. Alright, before you destroy me in the comment section and unsubscribe, please hear me out. So for a long time, since 2010-ish up until 2020, right before the YouTube boxing scene really kicked off, boxing had a major problem with attracting new and young fans. I think during this era, boxing really showed its reputation of being an old man sport. Outside of maybe Canelo, most of the big pay-per-view stars such as Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather were well into their late 30s or even early 40s. And unlike traditional sports, these fighters would rarely compete during the year. And I've already detailed this in previous videos, but boxing politics and the belt organizations really have prevented big super fights. However, when these super fights do happen, the boxers that usually participated within these super fights frankly were not very exciting for casual fans. As much as they were highly skilled and extremely dominant, they weren't getting the highlight finishes some other combat sports were getting during this time. No other fight can illustrate what I'm talking about better than the Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao super fight that happened in 2015. This fight was by far the biggest super fight in boxing during this time, and when finally all eyes were on boxing, the two biggest pay-per-view stars put up one of the most forgettable fights. So with big pay-per-view events coming so far and few between, coupled with the fact that a majority of pay-per-view stars at the time were towards their 30s and 40s, and there was a lack of young emerging stars, it's pretty easy to see why boxing has fell out of popularity with younger audiences. So cue 2019, when KSI fought Logan Paul for the first time. This fight did historic numbers. It generated 1.3 million pay-per-view buys worldwide, which puts it at around top 15 in all combat sports. And recently in a GQ interview, promoter Eddie Hearn said that Jake Paul versus KSI did around 2 million pay-per-view buys worldwide. Now this is unofficial and this was simply in an interview, but if that is true, 2 million would put KSI versus Logan Paul at around just outside the top 5 biggest pay-per-view events of all time in combat sports. So if you're above 500,000 pay-per-view buys today in boxing, that's considered a really big event. So for KSI and Logan Paul to nearly triple this number in their first fight and unofficially quadruple this number in their second fight really shows how much eyes are on these events. And I haven't even got to this guy yet. Jake Paul is probably one of the most hated boxers in the circle of influencers, if not the most hated. But just take a look at these numbers. His fight against Deji did 700,000 pay-per-view buys. His fight against Nate Robinson did 1.2 million pay-per-view buys. His fight against Ben Askren did 1.5 million pay-per-view buys. And his fight against Tyron Woodley did 500,000 pay-per-view buys. Nate Robinson's and Ben Askren's are very, very important because this would put him at around the top 20 biggest pay-per-view events of all time. So clearly, from all of these pay-per-view number buys, these YouTube or influencer boxing events are gigantic for the sport. Rarely do boxing events today even break 1 million pay-per-view buys. From 2019 up until now, traditional boxing has only surpassed 1 million pay-per-view buys on 2 separate occasions. Andy Ruiz Jr. versus Anthony Joshua 2, and Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury 2. KSI and the Paul brothers have done this on 5 separate occasions, with one of them breaking 2 million pay-per-view buys, which boxing hasn't done since 2017. So besides all the pay-per-view buys and all the eyes coming onto boxing, I think another unique aspect to YouTuber/influencer boxing is that they're bringing in a new audience. So I'm not going to give you more statistics and more pay-per-view buy numbers because I've given enough of that already in this video, but I don't want to bring up statistics for the obvious. Most of the audience that makes up KSI and Logan Paul or Jake Paul's fan base is very, very young and probably not traditional boxing fans. Like I said in the beginning of the video, boxing has had this problem of being labeled an old man sport, and it's been hard to have that appeal for younger audiences, and especially audiences that are new to boxing. I think these influencer fights reach a younger audience through social media, which I haven't really seen traditional boxing do, and I think it's something traditional boxing has had struggles in. So I said I was done with statistics and numbers, so here's some anecdotal evidence. I recently put up a poll asking if YouTube boxing was good for the sport and also how people got into boxing, and I was surprised to see a decent amount of answers say that they got interested in boxing after the KSI and Logan Paul fight, and I think that's fine. All of them seemed respectful to the sport of boxing, and none of them said anything outrageous like Jake Paul would beat Canelo. I think for a majority of them, once they get into the sport of boxing, they really do see the levels in which these fighters are at and see the professionals in boxing are levels way above the influencers in boxing today. I've honestly seen more comments saying that they're scared that kids will think that Jake Paul is better than Canelo. But again, this is just anecdotal evidence, and this is what I've seen personally. If you've seen otherwise, then I could be completely wrong, but I think generally the new fans of boxing that came from influencer boxing are pretty respectful of the sport. Additionally, because of the way boxing works and how super fights, or the fights the people want to see, happen so rarely, YouTube boxing gives the fights the people want to see the most, and it happens relatively frequently. I mean, all of these fights have happened in only less than 3 years, and we still have super fights in traditional boxing that has been anticipated for several years. So in this way, influencer boxing works. It keeps boxing relevant when traditional boxing can't. I have to be realistic. As much as I think influencer boxing is good for the sport for now, I think there could be negative effects down the line. So the biggest negative effect of influencer boxing is it may overshadow real boxing talent, and it may, to the general public, seem like boxing is more of a spectacle than a sport. Because of how successful influencer boxing has been in the last couple of years, this may take over as boxing's new image. They may overshadow traditional boxers and the talent that's in the professional level. So let's take the case of Eddie Hearn, who is DAZN's main promoter. You have a small subset of people that you can always count on to bring you 1 million pay-per-view buys. And wouldn't you focus your attention on fighters that bring you the most revenue? I mean, this may lead to other promotions taking a chance at this YouTube thing and making millions and millions of dollars. Focusing your attention on influencing boxing and giving more resources there may lead to less resources to young and up-and-coming fighters in traditional boxing, which obviously is a problem. But in conclusion, I think the positives outweigh the negatives right now. I think boxing is in a weird state where multiple organizations and promoters are preventing super fights, and this has definitely brought a new and young audience and kept boxing in relevancy in today's social media and modern era. Honestly, the only people to blame here is boxing. The belt organizations, the promoters, the politics have prevented super fights from happening more often. So if you really hate influencer boxing, or you really hate my take on this, you can't hate the player, you have to hate the game. I'm personally in the boat that all publicity is good publicity, and with influencer boxing taking over and boxing failing to bring the fights that the people want to see, it keeps boxing relevant and also brings it to a young audience that really hasn't seen boxing before, which in turn creates a new generation of fans for boxing. And honestly, that's all I really want. So what do you guys think? Is influencer boxing or YouTube boxing good for the sport, or is it not good for the sport? I personally think it is. Please comment down below and keep it civil.